The diner's neon lights flickered outside, casting a dim glow onto the wet pavement. Rachel exhaled as she finished cleaning the last of the tables, her thoughts drifting to her 6-year-old son Daniel, waiting for her back at their cramped apartment. It was late and she was exhausted, but tonight would bring little rest. Her paycheck wasn't due for another few days, and her final $10 had to stretch to cover a meal until then. She let her hand fall to her apron pocket, brushing her fingers over the bill as she headed to the register, ready to clock out. Just then, the door opened with a creak, and a lone man stepped in. Rachel glanced up, immediately struck by his appearance. He was an older man, maybe in his late 60s, his face weathered, eyes downcast. His clothes looked worn, his gray coat barely keeping the chill off his frail shoulders. He hesitated near the door before moving slowly to the farthest booth, sitting down as though the weight of the world rested on his shoulders. Rachel watched him for a moment, an inexplicable sadness swelling in her chest. He reminded her of her own father, who had passed when she was young, leaving her mother to raise her alone. There was something about him, a brokenness that pulled her in. She approached the table with a warm smile, though inside her thoughts were racing. "Good evening, sir. Can I get you anything?" she asked, trying to keep her voice soft, free of the exhaustion she felt. The man looked up, startled, as though he hadn't expected anyone to speak to him. He fumbled in his pocket, pulling out a few crumpled bills and change. "Just a coffee," he mumbled, his voice barely above a whisper. Rachel nodded, taking his coins. As she walked back to the counter, her mind turned again to Daniel, who had been asking for macaroni and cheese, his favorite, for dinner. She thought of the last $10 in her pocket and how little it could buy. But something tugged at her heartstrings as she looked back at the man sitting quietly, staring out the window. Without another thought, Rachel slipped the last $10 from her pocket and handed it to the cook. "Get him a hot meal, will you?" she asked softly, hoping she wouldn't regret the decision later. She reasoned that she would find a way to make it up. She always did. The man looked up in surprise when she placed the meal in front of him. A warm bowl of soup, a small salad, and a sandwich. His eyes widened and he glanced up at her, a mixture of gratitude and confusion filling his gaze. "I can't afford this," he began, his voice shaky. Rachel shook her head, offering him a comforting smile. "It's on the house. You look like you could use it." His eyes filled with something she couldn't quite place, perhaps sadness or relief, or maybe a lifetime's worth of memories, and he nodded, swallowing hard. "Thank you. Thank you so much," he murmured, his voice choked with emotion. Rachel watched as he ate slowly, savoring each bite as though it were a rare treat. She felt an unexpected warmth in her chest, though her mind kept drifting back to Daniel, wondering what she'd tell him when she returned home empty-handed. When he finished, the man looked up at her, his eyes glistening with unspoken gratitude. He opened his mouth as if to say something, but no words came. Instead, he nodded, a small, humble gesture, yet one that spoke volumes. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice barely audible. The words lingered with her in a way she didn't expect, settling into her heart with a quiet warmth. Days passed, and Rachel almost forgot about the man from that night, her days consumed with work and worry. She tried to keep a cheerful face for her son, who was too young to understand their financial struggles. Still, she kept a small picture of him taped to her station at work, a reminder of the reason she pushed through each exhausting shift. Then one evening, as Rachel was finishing up her shift, the manager called her to the office. He handed her a small envelope with her name scribbled in unfamiliar handwriting. Confused and curious, she opened it, her hands trembling as she pulled out a note and a check. Her eyes widened as she took in the amount. More money than she could imagine, more than she'd ever made in years at the diner. She glanced at the handwritten note, and with each line, her heart swelled with emotion. "Thank you for your kindness. That night, you gave me something priceless, a reason to keep going when I'd lost all hope. Your kindness saved me in ways I'll never be able to repay, and I will carry that gift with me for the rest of my life." The words were shaky, each letter written with care, as if from a hand still burdened by old memories and regrets. She couldn't help but think back to that night, to the sorrow she'd seen in his eyes, the way he'd gripped his coffee cup as though it were his last anchor. Who was this man, she wondered, clutching the check as her mind raced with questions. Rachel stared at the check, her mind reeling, barely able to process the numbers staring back at her. This wasn't just money, it was freedom. It was the chance chance to finally break free from the weight of overdue bills, the constant worry that haunted her every night. For the first time in years, she could clear her debts, give Daniel the stability and security he deserved, and maybe even save enough to dream a little. Her heart raced, filling with a mixture of relief and disbelief. How could a stranger, someone she'd only met for a few moments, leave her with a gift that could change the course of her and Daniel's lives forever? Lost in thought, Rachel felt a quiet presence near her. Her manager cleared his throat. "There's a gentleman here to see you, Rachel," he said, his tone strangely formal. Her heart stopped as she saw him. The man from that night standing in the doorway. His posture was different now, his eyes clearer, but the lines of hardship and regret were still etched on his face. He gave a soft, grateful smile. "I hope I'm not intruding," he said gently, his voice filled with warmth. Rachel's eyes filled with tears, a flood of gratitude and disbelief washing over her as she rose to meet him. I don't know what to say," she managed, her voice trembling. "This gift, it's more than I could ever imagine." James nodded, his own eyes glistening with emotion. "Rachel, it was your kindness that saved me. I had nothing left, no money, no family, and I was ready to give up." His voice grew soft, and he looked down, his hands folded together. "That night, I wasn't just hungry, I was lost, I was broken." Rachel's heart ached as she listened, realizing the depth of his struggles. "Years ago, I was someone else, a man who had everything. I built a company from the ground up, starting with nothing but ambition and a desire to prove myself." He paused, looking down, his eyes clouded with memories. "For years, I poured every waking moment into that business. I was driven, some might say obsessed. I told myself I was doing it for my family, for our future, but as the company grew, my world became smaller. I stopped seeing my wife, my kids, even my friends. I thought once I reached the top they'd understand, that it would all be worth it." Rachel listened, her heart breaking a little as she imagined his journey, a man who had been so close to achieving everything he thought he wanted, yet so far from the things that truly mattered. "I missed my daughter's first school play, my son's soccer games," he said, his voice filled with regret. "Birthdays, anniversaries. I always had another meeting, another deal, something more important to attend to. I was blind to what I was losing, telling myself I'd make it up to them once things settled down." He let out a shaky sigh, the weight of his regrets visible in every line on his face. The success came, yes, and with it came wealth, recognition, power. But those things, they started to own me. I spent my days surrounded by board members, investors, people who only saw me as a means to an end, and I believed them. I believed I was nothing more than what I could achieve. Rachel could see the pain etched in his face as he spoke, his voice growing softer, almost fragile, as though admitting these truths out loud chipped away at the armor he'd once worn. "The more successful I became, the lonelier it got. I was surrounded by people, yet I felt more isolated than ever. My wife grew tired of waiting for me to come home. My kids stopped asking when I'd make it to their games. Eventually, they moved on without me, because I'd already left them behind." A single tear slipped down his cheek, and he quickly brushed it away, his gaze fixed on the floor. "I tried to tell myself that I could fix it, that one day I'd make it right, but I kept pushing it further away, thinking I could have it all, my family, my success, my wealth." He shook his head, the realization of his losses clear in his eyes. But success, it didn't fill the emptiness, it only made it deeper, and when the company finally collapsed, I realized that I had nothing left. The people who surrounded me in my glory days vanished, and the family I thought would be there to catch me, they were already gone. Rachel felt tears welling in her own eyes as she imagined the hollow existence he'd endured, painful loneliness disguised by wealth and power. The night I walked into the diner, I had lost everything. My money, my home, even my identity. I felt like a ghost, a shadow of the man I used to be, wandering the streets with nothing left. His voice dropped to a whisper, trembling with the weight of his confession. "I was at the end, Rachel. I didn't see a reason to keep going, but then I walked into that diner and you saw me. I was just a broken man asking for a cup of coffee, but you didn't look away. You gave me a meal, a moment of dignity when I thought I had none left." Rachel's throat tightened, and she blinked back tears. She could hardly believe the impact that small gesture had on him, how it had pierced through the darkness he'd been drowning in. She thought of her own struggles, of the nights spent lying awake, wondering how she would provide for her son, of the endless weight of bills, late notices, and the quiet fear that things would never change. That night she had simply tried to help in the only way she knew how, by offering a little comfort, a bit of warmth, to someone who looked like he needed it. And for the first time in a long time I felt human again. The words struck her deeply and her heart swelled with compassion and humility. She had given him that feeling, something so simple yet so essential, a reminder of his own worth. She hadn't realized how profound her gesture had been, but now, hearing his story, she felt a surge of gratitude for that moment, for the chance to be there when he needed it most. He looked up at her, his eyes filled with gratitude and something else, hope. Your kindness reminded me of the man I used to be, not the CEO, not the man chasing success, but the man who cared, the man who wanted to make a difference. And in that moment I realized it wasn't too late. I could rebuild, not the life I had, but a life that mattered. I reached out to an old contact, sold the last piece of my company that I had left. It was just enough to rebuild and to give you this. He nodded toward the check, his gaze full of gratitude and respect. As Rachel took in his words, she could see now that the money he'd given her was not just a gift, but a part of his healing, a way for him to honor the man he had become through her small act of kindness. I know I can't change the past, he finished, his voice steadier now, filled with conviction. But I can choose to live differently. And Rachel, your kindness is what gave me that chance. You gave me hope when I had none. And I hope with this gift I can give you the same. They stood together in silence, both of them moved by the weight of the past and the promise of a better future. As he pulled away, James gave her one last warm smile. Thank you, Rachel, for everything. With that, he walked away, leaving Rachel with more than just the check in her hand. She held a renewed sense of purpose. She knew that her life had changed forever. The last $10 she had spent, a small sacrifice in her mind, had come back to her in ways she could never have imagined. And from that day forward, she carried with her the reminder that even the smallest acts of kindness could have a lasting impact, rippling out to touch lives in ways she might never see. Her heart full, Rachel walked home, her spirit lightened as if a heavy weight had finally lifted from her shoulders. She clutched the envelope James had given her, feeling its comforting presence against her chest, promise of the new life waiting for her and Daniel. When she reached her small apartment, she paused at the door, listening to the quiet hum of the night. She took a deep breath, realizing this was the last time she would come home to such uncertainty. The last time she'd have to face the silent fear of what tomorrow would bring. Tonight, she felt only hope. As she opened the door, she saw Daniel asleep on the couch, his little face peaceful and angelic. She knelt beside him, gently brushing a strand of hair from his forehead, a soft smile tugging at her lips. For the first time in years, she looked at her son without the usual worries crowding her mind, without wondering how she'd stretch her next dollar or manage the bills. Instead, she felt a deep, steady joy filling her heart. She could finally give Daniel the security he deserved. She glanced around their modest living room, imagining all the changes this gift would bring. No more nights spent awake in fear, no more going without, no more empty shelves. She could finally buy him the new clothes he'd been needing, the school supplies she'd had to delay, maybe even a few toys he'd pointed out longingly in store windows. And she could give him the most precious gift of all, her time. With this newfound security, she wouldn't need to work endless hours away from him. She could be there for him, really be there, to hear his stories, to see him grow, and to share in the moments she'd always had to miss. Rachel carefully picked Daniel up and carried him to his bed, tucking him in with a tenderness that came from the very core of her heart. As she watched him sleep, she whispered, "We did it, Daniel. Life is going to be different now. Better." She smiled, imagining the excitement in his eyes when she would tell him in the morning. For the first time, she could give him a childhood free of the worries and hardships that had plagued their lives. Later, as Rachel lay down to sleep, she felt profound peace that had been absent for so long, a warmth that filled her with gratitude and contentment. She knew that with James's unexpected gift and the hope it had inspired in her, this was not just an end to her struggles, but the beginning of a new chapter. Her heart swelled with gratitude for the stranger whose life had crossed hers, for the kindness she'd given and the kindness she'd received in return. As she drifted off, Rachel knew that tomorrow would bring new opportunities, new dreams, and a future she could finally embrace, one born from a single moment of compassion.